Hello listeners, and welcome to the Montel Weekly Podcast, bringing you energy matters in an informal setting. This week we discuss energy storage, a crucial component of the energy transition. We need backup when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, and energy storage is one way to do that. But what needs to happen to ensure that we have sufficient reserve power? Are price signals enough? For instance, over the past month, we've seen an increase in the prevalence of negative prices. At 2 o'clock on Sunday in the Netherlands, consumers were being paid an astonishing €400 a megawatt hour for their power consumption. An excellent incentive for batteries and other storage operators to fill their units to sell to the market at higher prices. Now, I'm Richard Sverrisson, and joining me today to discuss batteries is Matt Harper of Invinity Energy Systems and Mike Longson from Gore Street. A warm welcome to you both.
Hello.
Thanks, Richard. Great to be here.
Excellent. Now, I think many of our listeners may not be familiar with your firms. Could you tell us in a nutshell what you do, Matt?
Sure, yeah. So Invinity Energy Systems manufactures a product called a vanadium flow battery. These are batteries designed for ultra-high throughput and long-duration applications.
Okay, excellent. And
Yep, Gore Street is an investor in energy storage systems. So we've got over 250 megawatts of operational capacity in GB, Ireland, Germany, and the US.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Now, maybe we can start talking about energy storage. Why do we need it? I may have hinted a bit or explicitly stated stuff in the intro, Matt. But why is it so important in the green transition?
Well, I think the fundamental thesis that we have is that renewable power is, by and large, one of the lowest cost ways of generating new capacity on the electric grid today. And the problem, of course, being that you can't have it when you want it. What we see is, in portions of the electric grid and jurisdictions where they've got more and more renewables, there's more and more volatility in some of the electricity market prices, and therefore an opportunity for technologies like ours or others to step in and help regulate the supply of energy when it's needed.
And would you share that view, Mike?
Yeah, I think conventionally a lot of gas and coal has provided that flexibility, but obviously they need to adhere to ramp rates. So you have 15 minutes or so to respond, whereas batteries can now do that sub-second. So any deviations in frequency, so those were caused by either rise in demand or an increase in generation that's unexpected. So a gust of wind, for example, and that's what we're kind of seeing a lot more. Batteries can respond to that sub-second and respond to the frequency.
Excellent. So where are we now in terms of installed capacity of batteries, Matt? I'm thinking here, probably Northwest Europe or Europe as a whole rather than globally.
I mean, we've looked mostly at the UK, where there's about 2.4 gigawatts, I think, installed in the electric grid today, most of which is, on average about an hour's worth of capacity. So, roughly the same number of gigawatt hours. But, we see jurisdictions around the world starting to catch up with those levels of deployment. Certainly, some of the other jurisdictions where we see a lot of these batteries going in are in the southwestern United States and also in Australia, places where there are significant proportions of the grid's energy mix now being provided from renewable sources.
Excellent. And Mike, I mean, you say you're operational in many different jurisdictions or markets. How do they compare in terms of installed capacity for batteries?
I mean, GB is one of the largest ones in terms of the grid scale. So this is the multi-megawatt kind of systems. Germany, another market we're active in, has predominantly been led by the residential side. So these kind of 50 or 10 kilowatt hour size systems. So our battery's 22 megawatts, so it's magnitudes bigger. But across the globe, we're seeing different signals in terms of what's required in terms of generation. So GB, like Matt said, is mostly the 1 hour systems. And that's because it's been driven by policy instead of incentivizing those 1 hour systems or sub 1 hour systems. Other markets like ERCOT, so Texas, has been driven by 2 hour systems, or 4 hour systems. So those signals come from the policy side.
So are those policy signals then sufficient? I mean, where do we want to go? I mean, what's the limit? What's the maximum?
Sure. I mean, I think that what we've seen in general is, it's probably been a little over a decade now, maybe 15 years, that batteries have been installed in the electric grid in service of grid operations in general. And the sort of the macro level trend has been to longer and longer durations, right? The very first batteries were doing very short-term ancillary services, frequency regulation, voltage regulation, those kinds of services. We're now into sort of the multi-hour range. And I think what we see evolving as we, try to get towards, a net zero or close to it grid, is that you're going to need longer and longer durations in order for that level of renewable penetration to make sense.
And what's the maximum that you can have at the moment? I mean, are we talking 5 hours, 10 hours?
Well, there's a question of what you can build versus what you can fund.
Okay.
And I would say that we do a lot of our technology scales well to many hours of duration, sort of 4, 8, 12 hours worth of full power going back onto the electric grid. The reality though is that markets in most countries aren't set up at this stage to remunerate durations of that length. So can you go to those longer durations? Yes, absolutely. The technical ability is there. Are there the market-based mechanisms today to want people to go and build those projects? Not yet.
So what's needed then, Mike? I mean, what you talk about policy, putting in place these different kind of, or enabling different kind of hourly profiles for these batteries. What's needed to maybe extend that? Are we talking subsidies, direct incentives?
I think subsidies help build out initially, but what you need longer term is those infrastructure. So is it a capacity market agreement? Is it wholesale market signals? So like you said at the start of the podcast, the negative prices, that's really great for batteries, but that's very short term. You're not going to have that every day. So you can't then rely on that as an investment case to say, yes, we're going to guarantee being paid 400 euros per megawatt every day or every hour. So you need to have something that's either contracted, so is it a partnership with a TSO, so the transmission service operator or system operator, so like National Grid, for example, do you contract something with them more longer term to create like a baseline, and then you can do something else on top of that to essentially get your return on investment? Or do we see something more from the TSOs, and they're the ones doing the investment? So the subsidy and the agreements are coming from those rather than from the market. And you get a different balance. So different markets will do different things. So in California, for example, there's the vertical integration. So investment from external parties is kind of incentivized, but in other markets it's not, because you don't have that vertical integration.
Yeah, like the thing that I would add to that is that, we often think that, markets tend not to lead capabilities. It's the other way around. We need to be able to show the capabilities of these, new technologies and new, battery programs to be able to deliver against these sort of longer duration capabilities. Once that ability is proven, then we, think that there will be not only, the right kind of incentives, but ultimately the right kind of market structures that will go and support that. We've been very encouraged in the past year in particular, because of some of the support that we've seen in some of our core markets for early projects to prove that level of capability. We announced recently that we were awarded an £11 million grant by DESNZ to go and build a longer duration storage project here in the US. We're doing something very similar funded by the CEC in California. Those regulatory agencies are stepping in and filling a gap between what markets will pay for or will fund right now and what they perceive the markets will need to fund in the future. So we get those projects, we go and build them. They point the way to the kind of market structures that will ultimately support this kind of storage in the future.
So what are the kind of, I think many years ago, I was talking to storage operators and battery firms, and they expressed, some concern over that their services weren't that welcome in some markets. Has that changed? Are they you mentioned transmission system operators and regulators, etc. Are you now being welcomed with open arms, Mike?
Again, I think this is a geographical issue. So what we're seeing in something like Ireland with the DS3 program is that was designed for batteries, but now it's kind of a saturated market. So what was originally contracted has been satisfied, and now they're looking at other alternative investments in that market. Whether they change their attitude towards batteries, who knows? That's down to the regulator to essentially answer that question. What we're starting to see in the GB market especially is the use of batteries for other things where they would have predominantly used gas, which it's a great signal to see, but it's not happening with enough frequency that we take that as a positive. So there's definitely a lot more that can be done. So the balancing mechanism is a primary example of that, where on the days where you have wind causing issues on the grid, batteries are responding. But when there's a design for longer durations, that's where there's not enough longer duration energy storage systems to be able to respond in the right way. But batteries could do it, they're just not being used.
Okay, so that's in the GB market or across Europe?
So that's the GB market specifically, yeah.
Are there any other challenges or obstacles that you'd like to see that face companies such as as your own?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the biggest thing that we would be looking for is, not only for some of those mechanisms to extend to being able to fund or compensate longer duration batteries, but also to see those mechanisms be durable over a fairly long period of time, right? We have a comparatively low-cost grid system today because all of those assets have been amortized over decades. And, for us to go and build projects that, will get to that same level of, low cost and high durability, high performance, we also need to be planning these projects over that same period of time. That means not only planning for a technology that's going to serve that kind of, that decades of service, but also, the remuneration mechanisms that are going to stand behind it.
I mean, I'm just trying to sort of visualize, the batteries. What kind of size are we talking about here? I mean, obviously there's different capacities and different sizes, but generally, does it require a lot of space?
Certainly not a lot compared with some other renewable projects. We if you look at sort of the footprint of a battery storage plant versus a solar farm, you've got something that's quite a bit more energy dense. Our projects today are about 50 megawatt hours per acre. We're trying to get that up to about 100 megawatt hours per acre. So it's comparatively dense compared with what you would see from other renewables. With that said, space costs money, and so we always do what we can to keep that as compact as possible.
Absolutely. What's your view, Mike?
Yeah, I think that's where the technological question comes in. So lithium-ion batteries is predominantly what Gore Street uses at the moment, but as a fund, we're technology agnostic. Certain markets hold a premium on space. So the GB market, obviously very densely populated, so space does have a premium. Somewhere like Texas, you've got loads of space, ample space. Australia, another example, you've got loads and loads of space. But also if you're using a different technology, then you can kind of stack systems on top of each other because there's no inherent fire risk. So with lithium, there is that safety element that you need to have enough space between the systems due to regulation, like purely regulation. But I'll let Matt come in on the vanadium piece because they are unique.
Yeah,
because I mean, you use a different type of technology with your batteries, don't you? So could you
sure, yeah. So
explain why you made that choice and how it differentiates from sort of lithium batteries?
Absolutely. So our technology is called a vanadium flow battery. Flow battery essentially takes the portion of a battery that stores energy and the portion of a battery that generates power and splits them apart from one another. So we store energy in a large tank of liquid, battery electrolyte, and then we convert that energy into power in a portion of our system called a cell stack, which is where the charge and discharge reaction actually takes place. Part of what that means is that we are using a water-based liquid to store that electrolyte, meaning that the fire risk is near zero with these projects. Right, it's a much safer technology from that perspective. But the other advantage is having separated energy storage from power generation, we can scale that energy portion thing to much longer durations as need be. So as the market is going from predominantly half-hour systems to 1 hour systems, I think most common today, to the multi-hour systems that we see that will be needed to, for example, take solar power and turn it into overnight baseload, as we look towards, the last years of this decade and beyond. That's a capability that we can add into our batteries at comparatively low cost.
I mean, that's, yeah. And is that possible with lithium batteries as well?
So yes, you can. So I think the longest ones are 4 or 5 hours, but essentially that comes with an additional cost. So like lithium, the technology itself is designed to be 1 or 2 hours long.
I mean, there's a term that I've used before on the podcast. There's a German term, a Dunkelflaute, which like is when it's the wind isn't blowing and it's dark and it's cold, in sort of like in a cold February night. You're talking about an overnight, providing overnight baseload. How far are we from that scenario where the batteries can step in and provide that baseload for a day, for example, or 12, 24 hours?
I mean, in terms of doing that today, probably quite far away because there's not enough installed capacity to be able to allow that. So I think the GB peak demand is something around 30 gigawatts, and we've got 2.5 gigawatts of batteries installed. So you need 10 times or 15 times as much to be able to satisfy that. And obviously that's talking summer demand. So in winter, you're looking closer to 40, 50 gigawatts. And that's just one market. So if you're trying to do that across like Europe, for example, you need a massive deployment. Certain countries have kind of satisfied themselves, and this is where if we talk about battery storage versus energy storage, you have pumped hydro, for example, where you can have weeks worth of storage because it's just the dam and you let the floodgate go, generates a turbine, generates electricity. You can run that for as long as you want. So Austria, for example, has got a massive build out of pumped hydro. So Austria probably could do that. You wouldn't be able to satisfy the peak demand from what they've got installed, but generally that base load is there satisfied by energy storage. When we start talking about different technologies like batteries, you need to get towards that 8-hour mark to be able to provide that because it is overnight. Your peak demand kind of drops off around 8 o'clock and then starts picking up at about 6 o'clock. So you 10 hours worth of cover, but overnight demand is tiny, and you can then rely on the renewables to come back into it. You've got interconnection points that also allow that to come in. So Europe is one of the most interconnected grids there is. So you can have that neighbouring capacity. So it's not going to be dark everywhere across Europe. The wind is not going to be completely dead across Europe. You have the reliance of other markets like France, for example, that has that baseload nuclear fleet. And what we saw last summer was they didn't have enough water in the rivers to be able to cool those plants. So they were reliant on their neighbours to provide that backup. And that's what happened because you had the German with a lot of solar. We had the UK with a lot of their gas. Everything kind of came in to help each other out, which is great for an interconnected continent.
Absolutely, and that's the fear again this winter that the French nuclear plants would maybe there's some issues with corrosion, etc. So there is a concern that they may not be able to operate as well as they have done historically, going forward. But Matt, anything to add about the sort of the?
I mean, the thing that I would add in is I would sort of put a cost spin on it. The thing that we see if you were going to go and take, like you say, that 8 to 10 hours worth of power and deliver it overnight, you've got to be able to do it at a cost of generation or a levelized cost of the combined generation plus storage that is very, very low. Certainly lower than technologies today can support. We think of the cost of battery storage is in terms of the levelized cost of storage over time. Basically, what's the cost to dispatch each kilowatt hour worth of electricity from the battery onto the grid over its lifetime? That's one of the things we're really focused on because you need to get that number to on the order of about 5 pence per kilowatt hour. If you're going to do that, solar shifting, right? And use that solar power generated during the day, pushed through your battery, delivered overnight to be able to spin down gas plants, as an example. You've got to be at around that 5 pence price point. That requires, a battery that can do very, very high throughput every day of the year and do that for, the 20 to 30 year life of a renewable generating asset that battery is going to stand alongside. That's really sort of our North Star as a company, is to get to those kind of price points.
I mean, as a consumer, I have solar panels on my roof, but I would like to have a battery as well. But that's also quite prohibitively expensive at the moment. But are we also talking, in combination with aggregating, for example, when we get to a rollout of electric vehicles and households who maybe have solar and the batteries, is this something that can also be aggregated and work in conjunction with the kind of systems that we're talking about here?
Yeah, absolutely. So
a long way off, I think. But
yeah, we're already seeing like that. Those aggregated, so DSR, demand side reduction, so the aggregation of all of the smaller batteries or commercial batteries with solar, they can provide bi-directional dispatch, which is exactly what you need. So having that distributed system to be able to respond to specific events is what a flexible and sustainable grid needs, because obviously we are going towards more renewables. Like that's, I don't think anyone's questioning that. It's low carbon. If it's that gas element, that's when it's very, very difficult to answer, because the gas price is setting a lot of the power prices. As soon as that deviates, so then solar is setting that price, you get weird signals in the wholesale market. So you'll have negative prices during the day because there's too much solar, because that's just the natural peak during the day. The same with wind overnight, that you have it's just windy overnight. That's everyone can see that. So you'll then have low prices middle of the day, low prices overnight, and then peak prices in that morning spike and the evening spike. And batteries then would be accessing that. So that's where the signals would come in, and it's not just the large scale batteries, so it's not your multi-megawatt ones, it's then distributed fleets. So if everyone had a battery in their house, you probably wouldn't need massive generators or massive storage capabilities, because everything else would be like managing it itself. But this is kind of a utopian philosophy. Like this is a perfectly sustainable grid that's self-managing.
And it may not be enough for big, power producers. I mean, power consumers. That may not, be sufficient for aluminium or industry that relies on, that kind of level of power consumption.
Yeah, I think it comes down to what's most economically effective, what's going to be least expensive. Is it going to be, building out centralized assets or building out more distributed assets? And certainly there have been, you can see the benefits of having distributed assets for, things like power backup, right? It makes a ton of sense to be able to plug in your car and, run your house in the event of a power outage. Does it make sense to do that every day overnight? I think that, we'll have to see how it evolves over the coming years. That question of centralized versus decentralized is an interesting and evolving one. But certainly the kind of, digitization that you're talking about that allows those disaggregated systems to act in an aggregated way are very, very interesting, and could be a big part of that future.
Absolutely. So it's likely to be a combination of both, isn't it? I mean, it's not going to be one or the other here. But I just intriguing, on my phone, the battery now, I've had it for 3 years now. The battery life is gone. It's far reduced from what it was. What's the situation with these kind of really large scale batteries?
I mean, I think that the very large scale batteries in general, have similar, if not identical, types of degradation curves. I mean, batteries are lasting longer than 3 years, certainly, but they do tend to degrade. It is one of the advantages of the vanadium flow technology that we work with, is that we don't have a degradation based on cycle count, right? You get the same, you get the same amount of energy out of one of these things, in year 20 as you did in year 1. And, especially when you're planning, decades long assets that are going to serve the electric grid, that's very helpful.
I mean, is the technology changing quite rapidly as well? So in terms of the size of the batteries, et cetera?
Yes and no. We see a lot of new and interesting techniques and technologies coming to market. Certainly it doesn't evolve in the same speed as what we typically think of as, a technological development. Everyone thinks that, solar power has been this massive revolution on the electric grid, but really it's because, a bunch of folks off the grid in California started powering their remote cabins with these things in the late 70s, that we now have that amount of solar power being on the grid today. I mean, it takes a very, very long time for some of these power technologies to grow and evolve. So we're definitely seeing innovation, but it's getting innovation to the scale that it makes a difference for how energy is generated and used on the electric grid does take time.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, as I mentioned in the intro, and as we've discussed here, is that there's an increasing prevalence of negative prices. We're seeing that in certain markets, and there's no slowing down of solar growth or wind expansion, and analysts are saying this is likely to happen more and more frequently. Not every day, but certainly at times of low demand. Are you then seeing an interest from investors, from developers, from utilities in these kind of battery systems? Is that increasing as a result of negative prices, or has it always been there?
I think most of the markets are driven by the ancillary services. So that's the predominant reason for anyone coming to market to say, well, we want a battery. It's going to be doing ancillary services. that's what it looks like today, and it's probably going to be what it looks like for the next couple of years at least. The wholesale market signals are a positive, and that acts as a kind of revenue stack. So if you're doing an ancillary service, you may not be acting in that particular period, so then you can capitalize on any wholesale spike. So if you're providing like a discharge in terms of your ancillary service, if you can see a wholesale market spike or a negative price, so you can then charge, you can then top up your battery to then be paid for both sides of that dispatch cycle. But are they coming to us in terms of the wholesale side of things? That's not really happening at the moment. And as you said, like the build out of renewables needs to keep going and going before you have that consistency, because it's just not there. I think we expected this winter to have that kind of first indicator of wholesale market volatility to create overnight lows, evening peaks, and that spread just wasn't really there, apart from those very specific days where the grid was really, really constrained, and GP prices spiked to like £2,500, which is great to see, but that was for one day. So if in December, for example, if you were reliant on wholesale markets, you had one day to make your revenue, and if you then stuck to ancillary services, which is what a lot of the fleets have been doing, that was then the more profitable route. So
And in which kind of ancillary services do you see most activity? Is it the very, very fast response, or across the whole system?
Yeah, most of the ancillary services are fast response.
Fast response, yeah. Matt, if I can ask about funding here. I mean, we've seen a bit of a boom across Europe in sort of PPAs, power purchase agreements. Yeah. Is there a development here that sort of you have a hybrid PPA, so you have the wind or solar plant plus storage? Is that something that you see happening?
Absolutely, yeah. It's not so much the paradigm that we see predominant here in the UK, but a lot of the projects that we're doing in the southwestern US, especially California, and in Australia as well. That's a big part of what is being promoted and being pushed for down there. And it's one of the reasons why in those jurisdictions I think we see comparatively longer duration batteries being installed. Right, what you see in California these days is primarily 4-hour storage. Similar in Australia, where they have the same problems with negative pricing and whatnot. Those sort of 4-hour agreements for battery storage attached to solar generation is becoming more and more common.
But you're not seeing it in Europe. That's interesting.
It's been seen in Germany and Spain and now Portugal with the recent auctions. Essentially, the renewable capacity and grid connections were all driven towards renewables, but the ones that got the contracts all had an element that said we will install storage. So if you look at those results, then you can see a lot of storage being built out in the future. But what that will look like, who knows? Because it's essentially say we'll do a gigawatt of solar. And batteries, but they haven't said how big the battery is going to be, what duration the battery is going to be, just that they will do it.
No, I mean it's that. I think this is going to happen more and more. You can't, the risks out there are quite, are huge. And if you have that kind of combination, that hybrid PPA, then obviously that alleviates a lot of those risks. But you mentioned different markets. You mentioned the US and Australia, Matt. And there's a lot of talk, certainly for electric vehicle battery manufacturers, about the different subsidy schemes. Europe versus US and the Inflation Reduction Act. Is this something that you're seeing as well, that people are more likely to invest away from Europe and look at the United States?
I mean, I think the US was kind of first to the game in terms of the Inflation Reduction Act, in terms of a very broad brush set of incentives for domestic manufacturing. I think it's useful that other jurisdictions are now catching up. Because this is something where we want to see, I think, the broad industrialization of the renewables and industry in general in the countries where those technologies are ultimately going to be used. We've seen a huge amount of the solar industry end up offshore. We can see whether that will come back with some of these domestic manufacturing measures or not. But the bottom line is that, especially with storage, where there is tremendous growth expected in this industry, both in the utilization side and on the manufacturing side over the next decade, the question I think is, how can our governments make sure that both the manufacturing and the appropriate utilization of those technologies to serve the grid are very closely tied together.
I mean, well, what's your view here in terms of Europe versus US in terms of investing in the type of storage systems that the grid requires?
I think what the US has done with the Inflation Reduction Act is kind of a continuation of what they did with the ITC, so the investment tax credit. But that's not the first place to do this. So they had this kind of scheme in Australia that drove the initial batteries or battery deployments there. So it's not a new thing. What is unique about the IRA is the fact it's incentivizing local infrastructure build out. Europe is going to be doing a similar thing. It's not clear on what it will look like, but it's positively moving in the right direction. They know the build out is going to be there. A lot of infrastructure is being built predominantly for the EV side. So in terms of the lithium batteries, they will mostly go towards EVs. And then once you have that surplus in terms of dropping prices down, some of that capacity will go towards stationary storage. It's just naturally going to progress. So like I know we mentioned China in like our talking points prior to the podcast. They did a lot of investments in terms of the raw material infrastructure. So they got up massively ahead of the game, procuring all the different elements they need. So the lithium, the copper, the nickel, the manganese, everything that goes into a battery, China has in terms of their capability and their build out. You can move that elsewhere. So we can see the Chinese investment going into Europe, or so like someone like CATL can build production facilities here. We've seen the Koreans, so Samsung and LG, build plants in China. They've now moved them over to US, and you're seeing a lot of new players. So we're seeing like the tier 3, tier 2 battery manufacturers now going, well, we don't see any demand over there. We're going to put it here now. And the IRA drives that. So they will then build out new capacity to satisfy demand. And if that demand moves away from the US into Europe, you'll obviously see the investment coming in.
What's your view here?
I mean, like the thing that we view as most beneficial about the IRA is, the sort of the long-term stability of the incentives built into it, right? I think that what was so beneficial about the ITC for the solar industry is that it was well understood that it was going to be there over a significant period of time, and so people could not only invest with certainty in individual projects, but what we will hopefully see with the IRA now is them investing in certainty on the manufacturing side of the businesses as well, based on having some of these incentives in place. So it's that long-term view that allows both the capacity and the project to be built out that is going to be most beneficial.
In Europe, there's been a lot of criticism of how the domestic about the domestic solar industry, that it basically all just went to China. Is this a concern for the storage industry or batteries generally, that we're too dependent on China?
I think it should be. Yeah. I mean, if the dominant paradigm for our future energy system is going to be that we are installing hardware rather than burning fuel, which is essentially, I think, the way it's going to go. We should have a significant hand in manufacturing that hardware, so that we can, gain the economic benefit of manufacturing those building blocks, those fundamentals.
Matt and Mike, thanks very much for joining the Montel Weekly podcast.
No, thanks very much.
Most welcome. Thank you.